What's up guys, Mitch from the DIYRecordingStudio.com, and today I'm going to take you through 5 things that you probably don't know about compressors or using compression, because compression is probably one of the more misunderstood parts of mixing. And I find either when I'm teaching students or I'm talking to people online, there's definitely some misunderstandings of what compressors really do. And it doesn't matter if you're using analog hardware or plug-in recreations of vintage analog hardware. It's really important to understand how every different compressor potentially works. But we'll get to all that in a minute, so bear with me. But first up, I want to address the things you probably do know about compression. First up, compressors control dynamic range. If you've got lots of loud peaks in a sound source, we use compressors to pull those down and kind of tame those louder bits of information in a sound source, be it in a vocal or in drums or any other instrument where we're just trying to control the dynamic range and really kind of tame the louder parts, but also then bring up some of the quieter parts so we get a more even sound. And this is generally what compressors are used for, but they can do so much more than just that. And if you've watched my channel for a while, you understand that my approach to audio is that all this gear, they're just different tools. Doesn't matter if it's a plugin, doesn't matter if it's hardware, they're just different tools, and there are sometimes the right tool for the right job. And so what you need to understand is, what is the job you're trying to achieve? What is the result you need? And then what's the right tool to achieve that? Because there's no bad or best pieces of gear. It's what's the right tool for the job. Now, getting onto that whole thing of different tools for different jobs, number 1 in my list for today is that all compressors sound different. Now, some of you might be aware of this, but some of you might not. In actual fact, every compressor sounds different to every other compressor. If you're using something like an SSL Bus Compressor, it is going to sound very different to something like an EL8 Distressor, and that's going to sound very different to something like a LA2A. Doesn't matter what compressor you use, they're all going to sound very different. And that is part of the crux of why I say there is always a right tool for the right job that you're trying to do. You just need to know what those tools actually do. And in the audio world, there's just some real misconceptions about this. So for instance, if we look at the LA2A compressor, this is what we call an opto compressor, and it has a slower attack and a slower release. It's amazing on vocals, and it's great for compressing bass, and it can be used for other things as well, but it would be my go-to on those couple of instruments. Whereas if we look at something like the Distressor, it is a Swiss Army knife type of compressor. It's supposed to do lots of things, and it has way more settings that you can manipulate. It has heaps of different ratios and all this sort of cool stuff, and it's supposed to be able to do lots and lots of things. And it is what we call a VCA compressor, the SSL Bus Compressor. It is also a VCA compressor, and it has lots of settings here. Quite a different, much more sophisticated compressor compared to something like the LA2A. However, they sound completely different, and they might be used for completely different things. Okay, the 1176 here is another type of compressor. It's a FET-based compressor, so it has a more aggressive kind of compression and distortion that it kind of produces. So once again, it has a different sound, and therefore it's good on different sound sources. So what you've got to understand first off is that all compressors sound different and are good for different jobs. Maybe some are better on things like vocals or bass. Maybe some compressors are smoother sounding than others. Some compressors are punchier sounding than others. And we'll get into how that is and why that is in a minute. But just know that every single compressor, whether it's a plug-in or hardware, they all sound different to one another, and they're all different tools for different jobs. Now, getting into what I was sort of touching on is that the reason why they all sound different is because they all use different components to achieve their compression. Like I mentioned before, the LA2A uses this opto cell for compression, and it's quite literally some kind of light source facing a photosensitive resistor. The time it takes for that light to then hit the photosensitive resistor, and then the photosensitive resistor to cause the compression to take place, that time means that there's a much slower but a smoother compression. And as it starts to pull down the sound source, that takes a little bit longer to happen, but it's nice and smooth. And to our ears, that sounds natural. So the LA2A has this slow yet smooth type of compression due to the fact that it uses an opto cell to do the compression. Whereas something like the 1176 uses transistors. And because it uses transistors, if you think of this like in terms of guitar amps, a transistor-based guitar amp can sound real edgy and gritty and has a much more aggressive kind of character of distortion. Whereas if you're talking about tube amps have much smoother, warmer type of distortion. So the distortion characteristics of an LA2A are smooth and warm. I don't like to use that terminology, but let's just for now say that's what it is. But the 1176 has a much more aggressive and bitey kind of distortion to it. So say if I was working on a vocal and I needed a certain type of compression, what I would be thinking of is not do I use the LA2A or do I use the 1176 or whatever. Do I need an aggressive sounding vocal? And if that's the case, I'll reach for the 1176. If I need a smooth sounding vocal, then I'll go for the LA2A. Okay, so it's a bit of this shift in mindset. It's not, is this compressor the best compressor, blah, blah, blah. All right, it's what is the right tool for the job that you're trying to do. Same could be said for the Distressor compressor. So the Distressor also has a different type of distortion characteristic to the 1176. It depends on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve. And at the end of the day, you'd use your ears on these kind of things. The SSL compressor, the sound of its VCAs means that it gets this really upfront punchiness in the center of a mix. Things like kick and snare become more forward in a mix and more centered, but then also it kind of glues the mix together and you might get less width, but also it pulls in things from the left and right and you get this gluey kind of sound across a mix. And that's when I would use an SSL Bus Comp if I needed that punchy kick and snare and a bit of glue to the mix, then I'd reach for this compressor. So it's all about knowing how a compressor sounds and maybe why it sounds that way that can really help you choose the right compressor for the right job that you're trying to do. Now you might know those first two. A lot of people understand a lot about these compressors, but number three, I'm definitely going to say a lot of people don't actually comprehend with compression, is that all compressors are transient designers. And this is something that people do not talk enough about on YouTube. All compressors are reshaping the transient information of a sound source. Now, one of the best examples I can give of this exact kind of thing is something like the DBX160X compressor that I use all the time in the studio. I have a bunch of them just down here. This is a famous compressor used for drums because it adds this really nice attacky kind of sound to the sound of a drum source. So it's a very fast compressor, but what it seems to do is leave the very initial transient spike alone, allowing that to really punch through, and it kind of accentuates that. So if you want like tight, snappy, aggressive sounding kicks and snares, the 160X is an amazing compressor. It's actually underrated. One of my favorite all-time compressors there, not talked about enough. It's also good for, say you've got a guitar, like a lead guitar or a guitar part that you need to have a bit more bite and cut through the mix. That's a go-to compressor because it'll kind of add more transients. Now, where I find it is exactly the wrong kind of compressor is if I've got a vocal that's very sibilant. It brings out too much S's and too much plosives. So if I had a vocal that was too sibilant or too plosive, that compressor is going to make those things worse. So what I might reach for is something that's going to tame those kind of sibilant things, and I might reach for something like the LA2A, and that's going to smooth out the vocal. It's always going to be compressing a bit and taming those plosives and those transients and those S's and things a little more because it's always going to be compressing. So it just depends on what you're trying to do and how you want to reshape the transient. As I said before, if you want your drums to be more punchy, something like the Distressor might be an option. The Distressor has the ability to slam down really hard and actually clamp down those initial transients, and you can actually almost get rid of the initial transient and then it'll change that envelope, or you can leave the initial transient alone and then get it to clamp down and compress after that, or you can opt for slower compression and have it always compressing, and you can just really get all different kinds of transient information. So what I'm trying to say here is that all compressors do manipulate the transients and are transient designers depending on how you use them, but you should be choosing the right compressor to shape the transient how you want. If you want lots of versatility, maybe the Distressor is the right compressor. If you need something that's going to be constantly clamping down on a signal and really smoothing out, maybe it's an opto compressor that you want. So just something to keep in mind there. All compressors are transient designers as well as dynamic controllers. Number 4 is that most compressors, not all, but most compressors are also saturators. And this is another part of compressors, especially hardware compressors, that is often overlooked. Not only are we sculpting and shaping that transient information, we are also potentially, depending on the compressor, saturating and adding saturation. And the best examples of this, the 1176, if you dial it all the way off on its attack over here, you can actually turn the attack off. What that means is that it won't compress, and as you dial in the input and output stages, you are just using this box as a saturator. And that's something that's not often talked about, but you can use this box just to saturate a signal, not even compress it. You can just use it to saturate. And this is true of also the Distressor. It has a 1-to-1 ratio, which means no compression, it will just saturate. And the Distressor is called the Distressor because it's a distortion compressor. The whole kind of funny thing about this compressor is it's supposed to add distortion and harmonics and interesting flavor and characteristics, and it has a dedicated distortion circuit here, and it's just known for having that kind of ability to be quite aggressive and add distortion. The LA2A, I wouldn't say it adds distortion, but it definitely adds saturation and harmonic character to a sound source. Some people might put a sound source through an LA2A and not have any peak reduction. They might just run it through, turn up some gain and let it saturate. And that is a thing. Like, there are plenty of people that will talk about this online where you can just run signal through one of these pieces of hardware and it'll saturate, and just having it running through the gear can sound nice. So not only are these compressors controlling the dynamic range of a sound source, not only are they reshaping the transient information and redesigning transients, they are also, on top of that, saturating. They're also saturation devices. So once again, you need to have that sort of mindset. What kind of saturation do I want on this sound source? Do I want some kind of warm, smooth, harmonic saturation from something like the LA2A, or do I want something really bitey and aggressive in the saturation like an 1176? Do I want something that's really like creative and can get really aggressive, something like the Distressor? Or do I want something cleaner with way less saturation, like something like the SSL G Comp, which is way more transparent than any of those other compressors. It's punchy, but it doesn't add heaps of distortion. Or something like the 160X definitely is a much more transparent, cleaner kind of compression. It doesn't add distortion unless maybe you use these negative ratios, then it gets pretty crunchy, but for the most part, it's quite clean and snappy, and definitely less saturated than something like the Distressor. So you need to think and have that mindset. Am I trying to add saturation as well? Or do I want something more transparent? So that's going to dictate the choice of compression that you use, the type of compressor you use. So let's recap that. Compressors don't just control dynamic range, they redesign transients and they saturate. Now, this leads me to number 5, the 5th thing that you probably don't know about compressors. And that's if you are using something that controls a dynamic range, that controls the transient, so the attack, decay, and release and sustain of a sound source. And then on top of that, it's adding harmonics and saturation. That means that compressors are also timbre controls. They change the timbre of an instrument. They quite capably, on their own, can change the timbre of all kinds of sound sources. So what do I mean by timbre? Timbre is the combination of dynamic range of a sound source, the attack, decay, sustain, and release of a sound source, or the ADSR, or also known as the sound envelope, and saturation or adding harmonics or distortions is also going to change the timbre of a sound source. So all of these things combined mean that compressors don't just control dynamic range, they are transient designers, they are harmonic controls, they are distortion boxes, they are timbre controls. Okay, you can use a compressor if you really want to start slamming things into compressors and doing crazy stuff. You are affecting the timbre of that instrument. So where this becomes important is, what if I'm doing something like classical music? Well, those kind of musicians, do they want me to alter the timbre of their instrument? Maybe not. If I'm working with a singer who wants really clean, pristine vocals, well then they're probably not going to want me to alter the timbre of their voice. So therefore I'm going to want to use cleaner compression and be more subtle with these things. There is no best compressor. There is no bad compressors. There is just the right tool for the job. So if you want smooth compression with nice, subtle, warm harmonics, the LA2A is probably your compressor. If you want drums with real attacky, snappy, bitey, kind of slamming drums, maybe the DBX160X is your compressor, or maybe the Distressor is your go-to. If you want something that has a real edgy bite to it, but a bit of more fatness, maybe the 1176 is the go-to for you. What we all need to understand is that these compressors do lots of things. They're not just dynamic controls. And then once you understand that, that will help you make the right choices for the right types of compression on the sound sources you guys are using. So I hope this video is helpful to some of you, at least out there. If it is, please hit like down below. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe. And if you have any questions about any of the things that I've talked about today in this video, please hit me up in the comment section down below. I'm Mitch from the DIYRecordingstudio.com, and I'll catch you soon.